Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. This is Orphan Last, aka Skylar Madison, and today we're going to be playing around with base meshes. And this particular base mesh that's on the screen right now is supplied by Art with Amar, who's a subscriber and a friend of mine. And ultimately, the purpose of a base mesh is to essentially be the basic shape to what you're sculpting. As you can see, that basic shape can be something as simplistic as a stick figure with a cylinder standing in for the neck and the head. If this is the best thing that you can make for a base mesh, then this is, at the very least, serviceable. It works. And like I said earlier, Art with Amar made this base mesh, and I feel he should receive credit for this little piece right here. And a link is up there at the upper right corner of the screen if you'd like to take a look at his channel. If you'd like to join my Discord server, there's a link in the video description below. And the reason why I mention my Discord server is because I pinned this base mesh to the Share Your Work channel in my Discord server. So this means that it's up for download if you'd like, if you just join my Discord server. So you could just download this base mesh right here, and you could go ahead and improve upon it and do whatever the heck you want with it. Now, this second base mesh that I'm showing on the screen right here, this is something that I created. It's not perfect, but it's coming out looking all right. And although there are redeeming features to this particular workflow in creating a base mesh, it comes off to me as a bit academic. As you can see, I can grab each basic shape to this human form and pull this base mesh apart. Although you can make a nice human-shaped base mesh with a bunch of basic shapes stacked together and sculpted to match with one another, you basically wind up having to do extra work to get this kind of base mesh to its final stages and to be used down the road. So there are benefits to this, but there's also that disadvantage of it just being extra work. But on the flip side, this isn't entirely a horrible thing. I mean, you can duplicate these various basic parts, distort them into different proportions in order to make completely different characters. And I went a little bit more for the sorts of basic shapes in order to create something kind of similar to the Incredible Hulk's proportions or something like that. As you can see, as I place the belly in with the upper torso, I wind up going into the sculpt mode inside of Blender and shape the two parts to kind of match one another. I did find this particular kind of base mesh easier to alter proportions in a manageable and understandable way than what I'm going to be showing you later on down the road. So there's that benefit to this particular approach towards making a base mesh. This is a very easy in order to alter the proportions. So this kind of base mesh seems to have some redeeming qualities to it, even though it's extra work to work with. But I don't really feel as though this is a particular way of making a base mesh that I'll be using very often, even though it does have some benefits to it. Just simply because it's a multi-step process in order to get this thing to be one posable shape. That's the main criticism that I have with it. I can see this as being an effective way to create new characters, but this is just a bit too academic. And this is the same sort of critique that some artists have towards Bern Hogarth's work when they say Bern Hogarth's work is too academic. There's no question that Bern Hogarth was a very talented artist. I recommend his art books to anyone and everyone. However, Bern Hogarth was too academic with his work, and as such, when he made things like comic books, he struggled to put the characters in motion. That was something that he struggled with, making convincing characters that are in motion. His work kind of suffered when he worked in that field, the comic book arena. And so, yeah, it's too academic, it's too stilted for my tastes. So if this is your preferred way of making base meshes with, stacked basic shapes and such like that, if this is your preferred way of making a base mesh, it's not like you can't create something awesome with this particular approach, because you actually can, but it's just not my preferred organic way of discovering my character in a 3D environment, or even really in a 2D environment even necessarily. Now, right here is another kind of base mesh that I made, and it's actually my first base mesh that I've ever made successfully. Here you can see me enter into edit mode, and you can see what he's made of. He's just a series of vertices, edges, and modifiers. Specifically, the modifiers that I used in order to make this guy were the mirror modifier, solidify modifier, and the subdivision surface modifier. And in order to create this particular base mesh, I followed a tutorial made by Victor Deno titled Create a Character Base Mesh Blender 2.8. A link to that video will be in the upper right corner of the screen right now. And I actually really highly recommend that video. If you haven't seen it, then you really should watch and follow it. And in the video description of his video, you can actually download a JPEG sort of reference that's just basically a screenshot of his base mesh that details the location of each of the vertices and edges necessary in order to create this base mesh. And as long as you follow those reference images that he supplies in his tutorial, and you follow them as loyally as possible, you will wind up with a really good base mesh that is nearly identical to his. The base mesh made by Art with Amar that I showed at the beginning of the video was made with this exact same sort of workflow. It's more simplistic, but it is still serviceable, like I said earlier. It's weird because as you're moving the vertices and edges around in 3D space, you can watch the mesh kind of bounce and bobble around as if it's kind of made out of jello. So I actually worked on this base mesh for about 2 hours, and through quite a bit of the time, it was looking okay, but didn't really look like the base mesh that Victor Deno created in his video until the very last moment. The mesh was bouncing and bobbing around like jello, and it's amazing because right there at that very last moment, I had as close to an exact replica of Victor Deno's base mesh as humanly possible, and I pretty much just followed his photo reference as if it was pretty much doctrine, with only minor differences. Now, the thing with a base mesh is that you create it, and then you don't necessarily ever need to make another base mesh ever again, at least for that particular creature. Although you should actually continue to make just about everything in the sculpting process from time to time, just so that you never get rusty on any one particular thing, and so that you keep finding new tricks to put up your sleeve. But ultimately, after you make one base mesh, you can save it, and then you can duplicate it and make it into nearly any human character that you can imagine. Now, although you don't need to go all out with a base mesh, it is considered a basic sketch to your 3D model, a basic sculpt for your 3D model. And so I went ahead and duplicated the base mesh and started to create the basic shape for some new characters by going into sculpt mode. Now, most newbies seem to just rush into activating Dino Topo when they're inside of the sculpt mode and working on the mesh at a really high resolution, but a base mesh isn't supposed to have a really high resolution. It's only and just supposed to be the basic shape of your character. Now, the first character that I went about creating felt different from the first base mesh that was made up of a bunch of different basic shapes stacked together. I thought that I was going to make this particular character like the Incredible Hulk, but since I was still kind of figuring out a workflow for this particular base mesh, I found myself experimenting more than anything and wound up with a character that felt a bit deformed. I put in musculature, but if I were to make him look weaker, this could easily be a base mesh for an old man or something like that. When I was finished working on this particular version of a character, I wasn't really disappointed that I couldn't initially create a character like the Incredible Hulk. I actually felt encouraged that I could make something that looks interesting, even if it wasn't something that I initially was shooting for. And once I was finished with him, I set him aside and placed him with all of the other base meshes in my base mesh repository, basically. And with my second approach at making a base mesh for a character with this particular kind of base mesh, I decided I was going to put a reference into the document that is an actual official picture of the Incredible Hulk, and I initially tried applying all of the modifiers to the base mesh, and then tried to get the base mesh to conform to the new proportions by just using scaling operations inside of Blender, and that didn't really work out very well. Although that is possible, you can do it that way, it seems like it would take way too long to get it done effectively. And so I pressed Ctrl Z a bunch of times to get those modifiers back onto the base mesh, and I just basically started to play with the vertices and the skin modifier in order to try and get this character to the desired proportions as close to match as possible before even opting to sculpt this base mesh. As you can see, as I scale the skin modifier's mesh with Ctrl A, sometimes I'll accidentally create an annoying fold here or a weird bulge there. It's kind of frustrating because you can't get the exact shape that you want, but you can get something somewhat close, and finding something that's at the very least close to what you want is ultimately all that the base mesh is for. About a third of the time working on this particular Incredible Hulk proportioned type of base mesh was spent playing with the vertices and modifier. So even though it's a simplistic sort of concept for a workflow, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily quick or easy. And since I spent about 20 minutes to make this human shape, I decided to keep the vertice skin modifier base for it. And then I duplicated this new base mesh and then placed it into the sculpting area, applied all of the modifiers, and began sculpting it. Now I found myself somewhat trying to line out things like anatomy with these base meshes, and although you should try to at least form your base mesh so that it's capable of holding the anatomy well, the low poly nature of the base mesh makes it feel like leather hard, uncooperative, low quality clay. If you can line out and detail where the deltoid and the pectorials are, then great, but you're really not going to wind up with the control fidelity with so few polygons and such like that in order to create something like the trapezius, the latissimus dorsi, the abdominal muscles, or anything like that. And that's fine. You don't need to make the character too elaborate right now. It's just a base mesh. It's the rough sketch of a sculpt. In fact, for each of these base meshes, each version could be the basic shape and proportions for 50 separate different characters in and of themselves. So when you're working on a base mesh, you're more so creating a series of assets that can be used over and over and over again, and not so much trying to shoot for one particular character or one particular character's look. And while I was sculpting these base meshes in sculpt mode, 97% of the sculpting process was just tinkering around with the grab brush, and about 2% of the time I was using the crease brush to line out where the spine goes. You know, there's this little crease that goes down through the spine, and of course, you know, the crease for the butt, and to also try to shape up the deltoids, the pectorials, little creases that go on either side of the groin on the front of the torso, right where the thighs meet in with the hips and all that. That's where I was using the crease brush, and once again, I only use that about 2% of the time. And about 1% of the time, I was using the inflate brush. When the grab brush just didn't seem to create what I was going for, I would just use the inflate brush. But most of the time, the inflate brush wasn't doing what I wanted it to do, and most of the time it was just the grab brush being able to do most of the work. But just like any tool, the grab brush definitely has some strengths, but for whatever weaknesses it had, I would turn towards the inflate tool to basically compensate for the weaknesses of the grab brush. The inflate tool I barely even used. The next two base meshes went pretty quick, actually. Once again, I duplicated the original base mesh, and I decided that this character was going to be a fat guy. And just like I did with the Incredible Hulk looking base mesh, I played around with the vertices on the skin modifier in order to get that basic shape that I'd used to base everything on. And once I started feeling really comfortable with this particular workflow, I duplicated the original base mesh again and decided to go for something more stylized. I decided that he'd have a really wide chest, small hips, big deltoid, huge forearms, but rather thin biceps and triceps, thin thighs, and really thick calves. Once again, I wound up liking this new base mesh, so I kept this stylized version of the vertice and skin modifier base mesh, duplicated it, and then with the duplicate I applied the modifiers and I began to sculpt it. I felt as though I was able to form more muscle definition with this particular base mesh, a bit better than with the other base meshes that I worked on inside of this video. And I think it's primarily just the accumulation of experience, just like, you know, I've had a number of different attempts, and although they're good, this one's better. Now, the definition for the muscle definition is just mainly just basic shapes that a well-toned human body typically has, and it wound up looking really good. I'm really happy with how this turned out. Okay, so a basic rundown of everything that I've shown you inside of this video. And once again, so this is the Art with Amar base mesh that you can download on my Discord server. Link to my Discord server is in the video description below. You can download this. It's been pinned, and yeah, I mean, it may not be the most amazing stick figure kind of base mesh in the world, but you can download it. It's free. If you don't have one, it's there. So yeah, there's that option right there. And then here's the multi-basic shape sort of base mesh sort of system. Now there's one flaw that I haven't mentioned. Like, if you'll notice, like, the hands here, they're not lined up properly, and let me show you kind of how that sort of thing can happen. If I'm in object mode and I start grabbing things, you'll notice that they're kind of moving, kind of like tap dancers. They're moving in unison. But if I go into edit mode and I grab it, they start moving differently, okay? And that right there can cause problems. So this makes it so that, you know, this hand is not merged into the forearm the same way the other one is. So I need to go into edit mode and grab it and try it. Well, you know, it's hard to really even say what to do, really, to get them to match up properly. So yeah, I guess it's just a difficult process trying to switch into edit mode and object mode just to get things like objects to move into place properly in a way that works. I guess that's close enough. I guess the other approach is just to delete. Yeah, I could just delete all of this, actually. Well, no, I can't. Yeah. See, this is close enough, but it's not perfectly mirrored. So I would have to make this into one solid object, split it in half, and then mirror it again. And so that's a hassle. There are problems with this particular sculpt, and it's because that they're separate objects and such. And if you're not really all too familiar with moving around the origin and 3D cursor and all that, then this can become a real pain in the butt. So yeah, it's a good technique. If you got it down, it's a good technique. You can quickly change proportions. So yeah, really like it. Here's the other one. Let's take a look at the sculpts that I made. So this was my first base mesh right here, and I kind of showed it off earlier, but I'm going to go ahead and rotate around it because I think it's pretty freaking snazzy, and it turned out looking real nice. Here's the second base mesh that I wound up making, and once again, it's all just composed of those exact same control points with the skin modifier, and mirror modifier, and subdivision surface modifier. And then this guy wound up becoming this guy, and I think he came out looking pretty good. He kind of almost looks like an ape sort of shape. This is more like a character that's not so much like the Incredible Hulk, but more like Beast from the X-Men, I feel. It looks pretty good. I think the back needs a little bit of work, but ultimately I think it came out looking really nice. This is a base mesh that I wound up actually sculpting a little bit more onto off camera. You guys never saw this really, but it's coming along really nice. It's got the basic shapes that I kind of want in there that seem pretty good. Here is my decrepit old man, or generally like the evil wizard sort of base mesh sort of looking creature. I could easily change up the proportions a little bit. I could possibly even make his arms thinner and his legs thinner and shorter, and make him something like Gollum. And yeah, I really like how this one turned out. Even though I wasn't shooting for this one, I really like the way it turned out. Here is my Fat Man sculpt base mesh. I think it turned out looking pretty good in terms of fat people. So yeah, I really like how this sculpt came out. Generally, you know, I'm a fat guy, and I guess in a few years, if I keep going the route that I'm going, this could very easily be me, which is kind of terrifying. But yeah, here is another one of those base meshes. Once again, if I edit into edit mode, we can see that he's made out of a bunch of vertexes and edges with the skin modifier. I think it came out looking excellent, and I plan on using this one in a variety of different ways. I'm thinking maybe making his feet bigger even, but we'll have to see how that works out. And that wound up becoming this guy, really highly stylized looking, anatomical shaped kind of superhero kind of character, I guess. Huge freaking calves. Like, man, those, I don't know. I love the way this one came out. And like, as you can see, there is definition to his musculature. As I get closer to it, you can see it, but it's not like you're able to see the trapezius, okay? When you're working on a base mesh, you're not working on that sort of thing. If I right click and say, like, shade flat, okay, you can see that, like, I didn't actually move any of these, any of these quads or anything. I didn't do anything like that, but like you can see, like especially on his butt, like the low resolution made that just that alone difficult. But when I go shade smooth, it looks good at most angles, and when I wind up upping the resolution, it'll wind up looking a lot better, I believe. And so yeah, I mean, his pectorials look nice, his deltoid looks nice. There's not enough fidelity to get his abs in there without collapsing basically everything that makes his belly region. So I left that alone, but yet everything is there so that I can put abdominal muscles in there later on down the road with a higher resolution. I guess his groin region needs a little bit of improvement, but in general, I'm pretty satisfied with the turnout with this sculpt, and it's been a really fun video to work on. Anyways, guys, that pretty much concludes it for this video. If you guys enjoyed it, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe, and if you guys would like to get more notifications from me, feel free to join my Discord. A link to my Discord is in the video description below. If you'd like to support this channel, there's an image in the upper right corner of the screen that leads to my Teespring. Over there, you could purchase one of my t-shirts. Any support would be much appreciated. And if you've enjoyed this content and would like to see more, feel free to click on anything else appearing on the screen right now. Thank you very much for your time.